Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to another of the Teaching Academy PD series for 2026-30. This is in fact the final workshop for the Session 30 series. There will be a short layover period after this, probably about 4 weeks before we begin the lead into 2026-60. Can't believe it's flying past as quickly as it is. But then there will be a continuation of the supervised assessment workshops that we've begun on the end of this session as well. So for those of you that were here with us earlier in the week, we began running another series of supervised assessment workshops around designing supervised assessment, etc., with Ben Ifland and with Elise Hogg, who's joining us here today as well. And today's session, we're going to be looking at designing rubrics for supervised assessment. I'll make a short disclaimer here, and that is, although the session was originally titled Designing Rubrics and Prompts for Supervised Assessment, we're actually going to be engaging more with that question around prompts and questions, etc., for supervised assessment in subsequent workshops when we actually get into the substance of how we approach the delivery of the workshops themselves, etc. So today is going to be focused really around rubric creation, the design of rubrics, etc. Elise is going to be spending a lot of her time actually taking you through a lot of those design considerations and strategies in building rubrics and putting them together. And then in the second half of the workshop, I'm actually going to be looking at the functional side of rubric creation in Brightspace for those of you looking at how you're going to adapt the rubric as it sits in the subject outline, for example, into effectively being able to use it for marking, either for yourself or with teams of markers, etc. So that's the layout for the session today. As usual with these sessions, we are recording any artifacts from today's workshop, the slides, any Padlet decks, etc. We will provide you with those. You'll also receive a communication after the workshop giving you access to the materials after the fact. If you've got any questions or comments, please put them into the chat. We will be stopping periodically, I'm sure, to engage with some of those questions, etc. But it is always very healthy to see robust discussion happening in the chat itself whilst the presentation continues apace. So look, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Elise and I'll chat to you all a little later in the session. Thanks, Elise.
Thanks so much, Lachlan. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you today. As Lachlan mentioned, my name is Elise, and I will be leading you through the first part of today's session. So I'll be, as you mentioned, going to be looking at designing rubrics, particularly in that supervised assessment context. And then I'll hand over to Lachlan, who will walk you through the practicalities of Brightspace. I do encourage you throughout today's session to engage in the chat. If you have experiences, if you have questions, if you have your own tips and tricks that you'd like to share. I can also see that we have a large number of our wonderful educational designers in the room today. And I know that some of our EDs are in fact experts in rubric design. They're really passionate about it and they have a lot of experience working with academics to support the design of supervised assessment rubric design across the Session 30. So please do feel free, EDs, to jump in and share any experiences or tips and tricks that you might have. If you notice a gap, sure, I haven't covered absolutely everything here today. So yeah, absolutely. If you see a place where you can contribute, please feel free to either raise your hand or jump into the chat. And of course, that is extended to everyone else who's here today. Without further ado, let's get into it. So to commence, I would like to acknowledge country. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the many lands on which we live and work together. I pay my respects to elders within First Nations communities and acknowledge the continuity of cultures, languages, leadership and knowledge systems. I acknowledge First Nations people's continuous connection to country, recognising the unique, diverse identities and cultures of people in our communities, regions and nations. And I'm speaking to you from the beautiful lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung on Jandek country, just outside of Naarm. So I encourage you and invite you to take a moment to recognise the traditional owners of the country that you're joining us from today. All right, just to break the ice a little bit, and I guess just to get a feel for what you've been experiencing as you've been navigating supervised assessment, in particular rubric design in regards to supervised assessment, we'd love you to jump into this Mentimeter activity really quickly and just share what comes to mind when you think about the biggest challenges that you've encountered in designing rubrics for supervised assessment. So I'm going to copy and paste the link into the chat for you to have nice and easy access to that. Otherwise, you can go to menti.com and enter 38102275. And I'll just bring that up as well so that we can see the responses as they roll in. All right. So we've got one response so far, mark allocation, which I think is a really important one. You can see there's a few more people jumping in, so we'll just wait for those to come through. There we go, specific language, fantastic. Yeah, that's a really important one, absolutely. Ensuring that our criteria and our marking standards are really, really clear, really help the student to understand what the, sorry, I've just been distracted by the really, really problem. Yeah, helping our students to really understand how they've performed, how they've met the standards, and how they can improve. So that feedback piece as well. I'm not entirely sure what we mean by the really, really problem. So whoever popped that in there, I'd love it if you would be willing to maybe share in the chat. Articulation, adverb soup, relationship to other rubrics. We will be having a look at the relationship to integrated rubrics today in the session, so hopefully that will help there. Specific language, yep. Easy for markers, that's really critical. We want to make our markers' job as easy as possible, while still providing, of course, high quality feedback and information to our students about how they've performed. The split in the integrated task, yep, we're going to address that today quite comprehensively, so I'm hoping you'll come out feeling a little bit more prepared after that. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone who contributed. And again, we will hold this for our own purposes as well. So we'll look through this, we'll look at the today's presentation, and if there's anything that we missed, we can definitely pop that into our coming session for 60. Callie, ensuring rubrics aren't too packed. I couldn't agree with you more. I think having that really, really intensely busy rubric can be incredibly challenging for both the marker and the student. So that clear, concise language is really critical. Lachlan wants a copy paste button. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Those are really, really great points. I'll jump back into the presentation now. All right. So by the end of today's session, we're hoping that you'll feel more confident about evaluating your existing rubrics, designing criteria and performance standards for supervised assessment, and understanding how to differentiate your rubric when you're assessing a submitted artifact versus a supervised conversation or a demonstration. As Lachlan mentioned, this piece here, the designing effective prompts and question sets and stimulus materials, we're going to deal with that in a later PD session, just to ensure that we do have, oh, sorry, is my screen not sharing? I apologise. I thought I was. Thanks so much for letting me know.
Yeah, it's back now. Thank you.
Thank goodness for that. Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, sorry. So as we mentioned, this piece here about the prompts and questions, we will cover that in more depth and detail in a later PD session. So today we're really focusing on evaluating existing rubrics, designing rubrics for integrated and standalone assessment, ensuring that our criteria and performance standards are transparent and meaningful, and then setting up our rubric in Brightspace. All right. So first things first, I think this is a really important big question. Do supervised assessments require different rubrics? So I've pulled this across from the DLT Supervised Assessment website, so it's all up online if you need to access it or if you'd like to read some of the other FAQs that are available there. But the answer to that question, do we need different rubrics for supervised assessment, is not necessarily. So what really matters when we're designing rubrics is that the rubric is aligned clearly with the learning outcomes of the subject, that we're making explicit what students are being asked to demonstrate in the supervised component. And in some cases, this might mean that minor adjustments might be useful. So for example, we might be looking at clarifying criteria related to explanation, reasoning, or demonstration of skills. We might be distinguishing between preparation, so for example, the submitted written work, and performance or discussion, and ensuring that our expectations are really transparent for students. So there's no requirement to introduce separate rubrics solely because an assessment is supervised. However, in today's session, we are going to have a look at how we might design a rubric that has two components, one for the non-supervised task and one for the supervised component. And as mentioned earlier, I'll walk you through the design considerations before Lachlan shows you how these rubrics might be set up in Brightspace. All right, so if you were with us on Tuesday, this might be familiar. For those of us joining for the first time, just a quick recap. We worked through a theoretical example in our designing supervised assessment session on Tuesday, basically working with the theoretical first year journalism subject. We began with 3 assessment tasks, all originally non-supervised. The team needed to introduce supervised assessment without a full redesign. And this is really critical, I think, this idea that we don't need a full redesign. We can pivot, we can de-scope, we can take existing rubrics or existing assessments and we can tweak and make changes so that we don't have to completely change our curriculum architecture and infrastructure. So in this case, we've pivoted assessment 2 from a 2,500 word written comparative analysis to a 1,500 word analysis plus a 10-minute mini Viva. So you can see here that change. The written component has been de-scoped to make room for the supervised element. The total student workload stayed the same, as did our subject learning outcomes. So today we're going to use this same example to design our rubric. So here's a basic overview of the task. So this is assessment 2 or task 2. It's got 2 different parts. The first is a written comparative analysis worth 25%. So you'll remember that for integrated assessment tasks, the artifact, the non-supervised artifact or task, should be half the weighting of the full task, and the same with the mini Viva, 25%, just to ensure, again, that sort of equal split across both the components. Okay, so on the left, you can see what a well-designed task description includes. We've got the verbs and actions that our students will take, and they are in blue: identifying, analysing, comparing, identifying and explaining. The knowledge that they're working with. So we've got news values, framing, editorial decisions and journalistic ethics. And then the context that they're working within. So a broadsheet and tabloid publication, and then we can drill down even more deeply into how each of those outlets' coverages will be analysed and evaluated by the student. So this information will shape our rubric. Apologies for the coughing. I'm still recovering from a very nasty cold that's been going around. All right. So as I mentioned, our rubric criteria is going to be shaped by, the task itself. So the first step in designing any rubric is analysing your assessment task and learning outcomes. If your criteria don't align to your task and your SLOs, the rubric won't measure what it is supposed to measure. So in the middle column here, you can again see our tasks. They've been color-coded. Again, you can see the alignment between the task itself and the subject learning outcomes. So we've got the same verbs replicated across the task and across the subject learning outcome to ensure that constructive alignment piece. You'll notice that part A and part B also use the same verbs. Both parts are going to assess the same subject learning outcomes. The difference will be the mode and the conditions of assessment. So supervised versus unsupervised, written versus a mini Viva. And this means that we can use the same criteria for both rubrics, but with different performance standards. Okay, so we're going to move on from the task and the SLOs to the observable elements. These are the key things that you're looking for in your student submissions or responses, and they should match the skills, knowledge, and application in your learning outcomes and assessment tasks. So for our assessment, we've identified 4 observable elements. Each one has a skill being assessed, a subject learning outcome alignment, and an indication of whether it's assessed in Part A, Part B, or both. In this example, you can see all 4 elements are assessed in both parts. And the design of this integrated assessment is asking students to demonstrate the same capabilities, but under 2 different sets of conditions and circumstances. So the written component is going to allow students to articulate their thinking, establish a position, and support it using evidence and disciplinary frameworks. The mini Viva will then allow us to determine whether the student can explain, sustain, and defend that analysis in a conversational-based format under supervised conditions. These observable elements, which are drawn directly from the task and aligned to our subject learning outcomes, have now become our rubric criteria. Okay, so basically, these are going to be our 4 rubric criterion. And again, you can see they've got the subject learning outcomes, they've got the knowledge that the students are working with, and they've got the context as well. So really clear, easy to understand for the student and the marker. When you've written your marking criteria, it's a really great idea to review them using some of the CSU guidance. So on the website, you'll find a lot of really great guidance on rubric design. I've taken this one that provides guidance on writing marking criteria. It provides us with a clear set of standards to check against, so we can walk through these using our examples. So the first thing is, does the criteria begin with a verb? And yes, I absolutely do. And the verbs are aligned to lower order skills within Bloom's taxonomy, as this is a level 100 subject. So we're going to be expecting mostly foundational first year students. So we're kind of operating generally, though not always, at that sort of lower order thinking area, lower order skills, area of Bloom's revised taxonomy. We also want to keep it manageable, so a manageable number of criteria for our markers and students. Again, if you have way too many criteria, it's getting really challenging for both your marker and your students. When they're marking under the conditions of a supervised assessment, it's going to be very difficult for them to hold everything in their mind and to make those observations, particularly if it's a short supervised task like a mini Viva. You'll also likely cause a lot of anxiety and confusion for students as they struggle to figure out how they're going to address absolutely everything in 10 minutes. So yes, we've got 4 criteria, keeping our rubric manageable and understandable. Our criteria should include what we want our students to do, know, and in what context. And we've already gone through that, but you can see that each criteria specifies an action, the knowledge being assessed, and the context. Our criteria should not make assumptions about quality. So words like effective, satisfactory, or appropriate don't belong in the criteria. And for supervised assessment, generally resist putting words like confidently or fluently in there, as those are quality descriptors that belong in the performance standards. Rather, the criteria says what the student does. The performance standard says how well they've done it. Our criteria should align with the subject learning outcomes using similar words. Ours uses the same verbs as the subject learning outcomes, so the student can clearly see the connection between what they're learning, what they're being asked to do, and what they're being assessed on. And for integrated supervised assessment, the same criteria can work across both rubrics. You don't necessarily need different criteria for the submitted artifact and the supervised element. What changes instead is the performance standards. And that's what we're going to have a look at next. Right, so the next step is to write our performance standards. The DLT website provides really great guidance and a clear process for developing performance standards. So I've tried to follow this process to develop my own. I'm going to begin with the pass. So I'm really thinking, what is the minimum standard a student needs to demonstrate to show that they've met the learning outcome? And this will serve as my baseline. So I'll be able to go up. You might like to start at the HD level as well. Again, it really depends on sort of how thinking goes. I think starting at the pass is great for that sort of backwards design process. In a supervised context, I'm going to need to think about what competence looks like in a live conversation, because that's the format that my mini Viva will be taking. My students are going to need to identify and analyse, because those are my criterion verbs and they match my subject learning outcomes. At the pass level, I'm expecting their responses will be fairly limited in depth. They might be relying on general statements rather than specific evidence. They might be struggling with synthesis. They might not be drawing appropriately on the texts that they've been assigned. So with all of these things in mind, my P standard becomes identifies and analyses news values in the article, making connections to how they shape coverage without elaborating, and that's the key point, they're not elaborating, on why or providing specific examples from the text. Responses are limited in depth and rely on general statements rather than specific evidence from the required texts. Next, I'm going to write the HD. So in the supervised context, I'm drawing on the quality dimensions like depth of reasoning, specificity of evidence, the ability to make connections, and whether the student can extend their analysis beyond what they wrote. Now, I'm not expecting a huge amount of extension there because, again, we are still sitting in that level 100 subject, but I'd like to see them being able to sort of take what they've written and start to extend that slightly. So a HD student will be able to work through and extend their reasoning, referencing specific evidence from the required texts, and provide a well-reasoned evidence-based analysis. So I'm going to take these criteria, these components, and develop a performance standard for my HD, identifies and analyses news values with specificity and precision, providing evidence-based reasoning about how they shape each outlet's coverage. Responses are detailed and well-reasoned, drawing connections across both articles and extending analysis beyond the written submission. So you can kind of see the difference between those criterions, but you can also start, between those performance standards, but you can also start to think about how we're really positioning the performance standard description to really draw out those skills, those capabilities that we expect students to be exhibiting and demonstrating under the supervised condition. So what makes the written component different to the supervised component, whatever that might be? Next, we're going to fill in the middle. I'm not going to do that here today because I feel like it will just take up a little bit too much time, but we want to be thinking about how we can make each level qualitatively distinct. So we're going to ask ourselves, what can a distinction student do that a credit student can't yet do? And we're going to make sure that we're really clearly articulating that. Often I feel there can be a little bit of messiness in the middle of these rubrics where it can be difficult to differentiate between the standards. So that's a really important element when you are writing, is to make it clear. It's very easy to differentiate a P from a HD, but it might get a little bit more difficult to differentiate a D from a distinction from a credit. Step 4, we're going to check our language. We're going to ask ourselves, does every descriptor use the same verb as the criterion? Are distinctions measurable, or are we relying on vague words like adequate or satisfactory? These are not measurable, so again, they can be quite difficult to assign a value to, and they can be quite difficult for a student to kind of judge where they're actually sitting performance-wise as well. Where possible, quantify. So you could say, at least 2 news values, some news values, not necessarily something you have to do, but it might be something depending on what the assessment looks like. And is the progression clear and consistent across all levels? Remember also that your performance standards are your primary feedback tool. So when a student receives their rubric, the descriptor at their level tells them what they demonstrated. And the descriptor at the next level tells them what to work towards. So if the descriptors are too vague, the student isn't going to get the benefit of that feedback and that feed forward. So it's really, I think, helpful to put ourselves into the shoes of our students. Really think about, if you're a student, are you going to be able to understand these performance standards? Are they understandable? Are they clear? Are they comprehensible? Can your student easily see from the rubric what they specifically need to do to improve their performance, and also understand where they're currently sitting within those performance standards and why? Step 5 is we check for consistent marking. So could 2 different markers read these descriptors and reach the same judgment? For supervised assessment, this is really important because, of course, as markers, we're often applying the rubric in real time. It's much more difficult to go back and reread a conversation the way that we can reread an essay. Of course, recordings will be available for many of our supervised tasks, but it's not super ideal for our markers to have to go back and rely on these, obviously from a workload perspective, from a time perspective, and just, I think as well, if you are unable to kind of begin to establish where the student is sitting in the rubric during the session, it will also be tricky to have that follow-up conversation if you are having one of those after the session or after the supervised element concludes. So the scripters really need to be clear enough to be held in mind during a 10-minute conversation by both the student and the staff member who is doing the assessing. All right, let's have a look at differentiating performance standards. So as we've just seen, for our integrated supervised assessment tasks, both rubrics use the same criteria and the same subject learning outcomes, but the performance standards are different because we're observing different things. So when you're reviewing a submitted artifact, you're engaging with a product or artifact that you can count and quantify. Sorry, not necessarily, you can count and quantify. You can assess argumentation, you can assess synthesis, depth of engagement with sources, etc. And when you're assessing a supervised task, it's a little bit different, of course. You're watching and listening in real time. So your standards need to describe observable behaviour. There are multiple dimensions that you can differentiate across. So for example, skills, knowledge, depth of reasoning, specificity of evidence, responsiveness to follow-up questions, connection making, the ability to extend beyond what was prepared, and the independence of the student. So how much guidance were they requiring? And whether or not these are appropriate, of course, will depend on your task, depend on your learning outcomes, and what exactly it is that you're assessing. But these are some, I guess, a nice little menu of potential things that you might like to think about. All right, before I hand over to Lachlan, who's going to show you how to put all this together in Brightspace, I just wanted to share this really great resource that is on the website that helps to evaluate your rubric. So I'll just open that one up. I already have it open. I don't need to open it up. I've just gotten launched. There we go. Okay, so this is an excellent tool because it goes through a really comprehensive and holistic sort of approach to rubric evaluation. So we've got the general attributes of the rubric around things like, are we providing sufficiently detailed feedback to our students? Is the rubric sufficiently specific to facilitate objective, so reliable and valid rather than subjective evaluation of the student's work? And we talked a little bit about vague sort of descriptors of performance standards. Obviously, your very good may not be the same as my very good. So we really need to provide those specific qualities so that our markers and students know exactly what very good actually means and what it looks like. Is the language clear and helpful? Is the rubric's format easily interpreted by students and markers? We can have a look at our criteria as well. Again, are they relating specifically to the assessment task and the SLOs? Do the criteria develop deep and or advanced learning as well as basic competency? Have effective criteria assessing attitudes and values been included if they are relevant? The criteria free of descriptors such as satisfactory or effective? Again, these belong in the standards, not the criteria. And then through to the standards, do they reflect a clearly stepped and consistent taxonomy? So is the language consistent in addressing the same quality at each level, or does it jump to different qualities at different levels? Are we avoiding using norm reference descriptors such as average, exceptional, feedback qualities as well, which we've talked a little bit about. So again, really ensuring that those rubric performance descriptors are helping the students to understand where they're at, where they're going, how they can get there, and why they're currently sitting where they are. And then finally, assigning grades. So are we weighting marks in a way that contributes to the likelihood of the outcome reflecting the marker's holistic impression? So if you are weighting your academic writing quality too low, would it be possible for a barely literate response to still achieve a high grade? Possible. Potentially, if it's barely literate, you would probably think it wasn't hitting the other marks, but I suppose in some sort of edge cases, maybe that would be a potential possibility. And then does the language used to make it clear that to attain a particular grade, the described level of performance against all criteria is essential? or whether performance at that level against a sufficient portion of the criteria would justify the grade. So I'll share this one into the chat, but I also would really encourage you to explore the DLT assessment website to support you with your rubric design. There's some really, really fantastic resources. And again, I've tried to base today's session on the processes and considerations that are outlined here to really ensure that I am aligned to Charles Sturt processes and practices. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I'm going to hand over to Lachlan now, who again is going to walk you through some of those considerations for Brightspace. So thanks so much, Lachlan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Elise. All right, so look, as Elise has mentioned, I'm going to attempt now to not talk specifically around the substance of what goes into a rubric. That's what Elise has been addressing. What I'm going to be concentrating on here is the process of taking what goes into that rubric and making it workable inside the Brightspace rubric tool. So essentially a pragmatic focus around making the rubric functional for your markers, and potentially raise a few questions about how you go about doing that, when you go about doing that, and how that might then inform potentially how you write the rubric in the first instance in terms of structure, rather than, again, as I said, talking about the substance. So let me share my screen. As I'm sure many of you are aware, I am partial to using Padlet walls to help guide my own thinking process. So let me share the link to that in here for you. And I'm going to start this process by asking you a few questions to think about before we start wading into both some examples about how this process has been done, but also looking at the tool set itself, the rubric building tool set. So here's a few questions for you to think about, and by all means, if you want to respond to any of them in the chat, etc., do so, but I'll keep going at this point. So a few questions. When approaching your rubric, one of the obvious ones, who's doing the marking? So I'm asking this for a couple of reasons. One of them is, do you think it's important within the rubric itself inside Brightspace, as in the artifact that the student is going to be receiving at the end of the process, is it going to be important for either the student or the convener or anyone else involved in this equation to be able to identify who the marker is? If that's a part of it, there is a feature within the rubric tool that will allow you to do that. Essentially, we can pre-populate feedback fields that indicate that the marker is meant to either put their initials in there or identify themselves in some way. And the reason this becomes perhaps important in this process is particularly with things like an integrated task. There's every likelihood that the person that's marking the artifact in the first instance is not going to be the same person as the person who's marking the supervised component of the task. If at some point in time it's going to be necessary to be able to distinguish between the two without someone going back through the site and looking at assignment settings and maybe the class list and other things, or group settings, and trying to figure out who it was that was doing what at the time, a very simple way of doing that is to build a field within the rubric that actually identifies who's doing the marking. So even with an initial. So I think about that. Why? Because obviously it's part of the evidence collection that we have going on, not just in supervised assessment, but in the marking of any assessment. But as I mentioned, it is a very, very quick and easy way to be able to identify who's doing what. Similarly, if we can pre-populate fields within the rubric tool, are there any other pieces of information that you'd like captured in that evidence document? Something to think about. All right. Arguably one of the most important components in creating both the rubric and your assignment or your quiz portals is thinking about how the sequence of both student submission and marking is going to happen for this activity. It's important to think about that timing because it's going to determine how many assessment portals you're going to be creating, how many rubrics you're going to be needing, whether or not you're going to be using a single rubric that gets split into different sections, or whether you're going to need to create multiple rubrics so that you can address the timing requirement. The reason this crops up more for supervised assessment and integrated tasks specifically is when we have conveners who want a feedback loop to be happening for the student in between the submission of the artifact, the written component or the submitted piece from the student, and the completion of the supervised component. If there is a gap between those two things, it means we're going to have to publish our feedback from the first part so that we can then have the student and potentially the markers informed prior to the completion of the supervised component. That cannot happen inside a single assignment portal unless you're publishing, unpublishing, retracting, etc. inside Brightspace. It starts to get very, very messy and a lot more time consuming, and it may very well mean that you need to create separate assignment portals. Submitting the first part, let's say part A, for example, the artifact, having the marking completed, publishing the marking, and then having the actual evaluation of the supervised component happening in a second portal. And effectively what you'll see on this board shortly is that the golden rule with Brightspace assignment portals and rubrics is that for each portal you have a single rubric. Unless you have a very, very good reason for using multiple rubrics. One example I can think of is OSCEs with nursing, for example. They have multiple attempts happening and they'll have several rubrics, one for each of the attempts. And at that point, as long as you understand that the latest marking of a rubric in Brightspace, whichever rubric you're using, is the one that Brightspace will take to populate the overall task mark, it will override and remove any other score, for example, that has previously fed through to the total, which is why we have to be very careful about separating our portals and our rubrics if necessary. I'll get more into this and show you the actual tool and the portals that I'm talking about. But it is, again, worth thinking about when is the marking going to be happening? Do the students need feedback initially before they actually engage in the supervised component of the task? All right, next up. This one I think is probably similar to some of the messaging that Elise was raising earlier, is that if you're thinking about how the marking is going to be happening, or what the markers have to deal with in what's gone into the rubric itself, quite often a lot of the questions are raised around students engaging with the rubric and whether or not it's clear enough for them, but obviously this applies equally to the markers. So the clearer the rubric is, both in terms of scores, marking, I guess the explicitness of the descriptors that are going in against each of your marking scales, all of that is going to contribute to reducing any potential misunderstandings about the marking process. It'll help with your moderation processes, your marker meetings, and the time that requires to be spent around unpacking that process. All of those can be made a lot easier by having a really clear and explicit rubric. And just judging by a lot of the rubrics that I see in subject outlines, it seems fairly apparent that that kind of consideration around the marking process has not informed the creation of the rubric in the first instance. So if you're thinking about that before the subject outline itself is published, it's going to help you when you actually come to Brightspace to create the rubric itself. So most of the time, a lot of the jobs that we receive around rubric creation in Brightspace, the rubric's already done and dusted. It's in the subject outline, it's been published, it's been made available to students, but now we want to think about it in terms of a supervised component, what we have to do to dissect the original rubric so that it works for marking and for those processes. Do yourself a favour, if you have the time available to think about the rubric in terms of the marking process, before you publish the outline. It will help and reduce the time required when you actually need to create the Brightspace rubric itself. All right, let's talk a little bit about some things that I would suggest that you do when you're creating a rubric. We'll look at the do's and don'ts. Then we're going to go through an example of an original rubric that has been converted to be used for a supervised assessment. And I am keeping an eye on the chat and things as well as this goes. All right, so these are a few suggestions. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a starting point for you to think about. First one, a lot of people are moving across to this idea of the fact that the rubric itself, the scores that go into a quantifiable rubric, do not have to be the same as the task weighting. Brightspace and the rubric tool will convert that total automatically to whatever your task weighting is in the assessment portal. This becomes important because when people are dealing with tiny, tiny numbers, fractions of numbers and decimals, etc., because this criterion is worth 5%, and if the task is weighted out of 30 or 40 or whatever the case may be, these numbers start to get very, very small and difficult to deal with when we're trying to calculate what our HD through to fail continuum is. Do yourself a favour, figure out the rubric values out of 100. It's going to make this process so much easier. Some schools have been doing this for a very long time. I'm encouraging all of you to think about it, at least, when you're putting together the scores for the rubrics. It is a much easier process than simply trying to say, well, the task weighting is 40%, so hence my rubric must be 40 as well, and then trying to then figure out those tiny, tiny numbers. It's not really necessary because Brightspace will do the conversion for you. It didn't used to happen in Blackboard, and so for those of you who've been teaching here for quite some time in the old LMS and knew that they had to do manual conversions of those numbers, unless the weighting and the rubric values were the same, we don't have that problem anymore. Brightspace will take carriage of this for us. So consider very early on the idea of your rubric values being out of 100. It just makes splitting this, particularly for supervised assessment where you have the original artifact submission versus the supervised component, splitting that in half essentially, so much easier. Next one. Elise mentioned this also as part of what she was talking about earlier. If you have the opportunity in the rubric tool to use clear, concise and explicit labelling, and that applies to things like criterion labels, section labels, if you've split it into part A and part B, etc., your scale values, obviously the way that you allocate your points and your marks, and also the overall score section in the rubric tool, make it as clear and obvious as possible. The number of times we see rubrics where they don't use language to even indicate which particular criterion is being talked about, apart from someone being familiar with the paragraph of text that's gone into that label, there's an opportunity here to simply put in a number, criterion 1, criterion 2, criterion 3. You can make both your markers being able to locate these criterion areas, the convener later on, your moderators, etc., and the students, if you're referring to parts of what they need attention to within a rubric, it's going to be that much easier if you just use some of that clear labeling and language inside the rubric itself. We're going to have a look at the rubric tool itself when we look at the options for creating our rubrics. It has a couple of sections which overwhelmingly we would recommend you use in the same way. The first is that given that the students are provisioned with the rubric in the subject outline, they have it from week -2, you don't necessarily have to provide the Brightspace rubric attached to the assignment to the student up front. It makes more sense, arguably, that it's given to them as a part of their feedback when the marking is completed. So this option that you can see on the screen here, where we're talking about the rubric being hidden from the students until their feedback is published, is generally the go-to value that we would recommend when creating the rubric in Brightspace. They already get it somewhere else. The other thing is that if you're familiar with all of the preamble text that students get before they're able to submit an assessment, So there is academic integrity disclaimers, there's Turnitin information, there is I think AI disclosure use potentially, if not in there already, that's going to go in there. The task description itself, there's a lot of scrolling and text going in front of the student before they can even locate the text for their assessments, etc., to submit their documents. I don't think we need to add to that by adding the rubric page itself or pages in front of them. It just creates an unnecessary experience in terms of how easy it is for them to submit a task. So again, another reason why we would hide the rubric from the students until the feedback's ready to be published. The second option is the numbers and the scores that go into your rubric. Do you want the students looking at the numbers and the points and potentially the fractions of points that have gone into how a particular scale against a criterion has been reached? So why did I get 22.15 for this rather than 22.36, etc.? Or do you want them focusing on the fact that they got a credit as opposed to a pass or a distinction, etc., and looking at the actual descriptor to understand why they reached those values? Some people like to make the score point allocation visible, and many actually just hide those scores. Doesn't stop them seeing the actual scale value that they've reached or reading the descriptor itself, but it does stop them focusing on the actual granular point values. So maybe you want to consider hiding the scores as well in the options. All right, continuing on. The rubric tool has a preview function. I'll show it to you in a moment. It will allow you, when you're building the rubric, to see what the rubric looks like to students. As a part of building it in the first place, I'd recommend that you preview it at least once so that you can see that it is laid out clearly, that there aren't any formatting discrepancies, etc., and that it actually makes sense. It's a very quick and easy way to just sanity check the rubric prior to it getting put in front of the students. It also has a print function right there, so it'll give you a soft copy of the rubric that you're building. And I'm going to talk about the overall score function in the rubric and why it's important. We talk about this in the rubrics workshop that we run quite often during the PD series, but if you populate the overall score section of the rubric tool, it will also allow you to use the rubric statistics tool inside Brightspace to get your mark distribution happening whilst draft marking is happening. There is no other way in Brightspace for you to see the scores for your assessments as the draft marking is happening. You have to actually publish the marks themselves and then potentially use the grade moderation tool or go into the gradebook after publishing has happened. If you use the overall score area of the rubric and it's populated accurately, you can use the rubric statistics function to actually see the spread of your marks as marking is happening live, draft marking. So all of it relies upon the fact that you've taken the time to populate the overall score section in the rubric. So I think what I want to do is actually take you through an example. Then I have a few don'ts that I'll bring up at that point. So let's look at a subject. We have BMS 263, which is run in session 30. We have a supervised assessment, which has happened here, where the artifact that's been submitted is a voice over PowerPoint presentation, and the supervised component is a mini Viva which engages with it. There's the assignment portal. If we actually take a moment to look at the subject outline very briefly for task 2, what we're going to see here, task description lays out the task here. Doesn't really talk too much about what's happening in the mini Viva so much, but again, I'm not getting into the substance. I want to look at the functional aspects of building the rubric inside Brightspace. So the part that I want to focus on here is in the original rubric, the marking criteria and standards, well, they don't say which criterion. There's no criterion labels at this point. I can't really see from this, if I have a look, which part is the artifact and which part is the supervised component. Responses to questioning. Okay, this might be referring to the supervised component. And then there's an explanation here and responses to questioning. Okay. That suggests that that's the supervised component. There isn't really clear articulation in the rubric in the first instance about which part is the artifact and which part is the supervised component, which means it becomes discretionary if I change nothing, that the markers figure out what they're allocating points for and when. We have a single rubric. We also have one set of marks which we know will need to be split 50-50 between the artifact and the supervised component. That hasn't happened yet within the rubric. So that potentially is going to be a problem. We do have quite a few criterion that have gone in here, but we haven't yet seen a distinction between what's being marked and when, between the submitted component and the supervised component of the task. So that's what's gone into the subject outline. And then we've had to go about creating a rubric or rubrics for the supervised component of the task. Can everyone see why that's something that's going to need attention before we can actually mark this task in Brightspace? Is that sort of apparent why it's going to need some attention? I think I can see a nod or two. All right. Let's go back into Brightspace and we'll have a look at the rubric itself. Into our subject admin and rubrics, we can see that the rubric that's been used for this task is locked because marking has happened or is in the process, but let's open it up and have a look at it. Now what we can see that's happened here is that the rubric has been split. One single rubric has been split into two sections, and in fact the term that we have in Brightspace is a group or a category. You'll see that language that's used. So we have the first section, which is now able to be labelled as Part A, which is the artifact. We've got labelling happening here, criterion 1, there's that first one, and the text in this case has simply been duplicated but has been split into those Part A and Part B areas. The point values have been halved. So it has in fact been converted. If we go across and find out, the first part is now out of 10 as opposed to what it was in the subject outline. The subject outline gave the weighting for this task to be identical to in the rubric to what the weighting was for the task. The rubric has been converted to being out of 100. So there has been a conversion process that's happened here. But we've split criterion 1 for Part A into a second section. If we scroll down to the second part, here's our second part, which is the supervised component. And you'll see that criterion 1 is in there again, but this is now for the marker of the supervised component to allocate their score. So they have been split into two sections with the values or the point allocation being calculated out of 100. Down the bottom, we can see that the overall score value has been populated to be out of 100. And then that value will then be converted back to that task weighting out of 40%, for example. If we have a look at the options that have been used, the rubric has been set to being hidden from students until the feedback's been published, and then not providing the actual point values to the student. In this case, the students will be focusing on the actual scale that they've achieved, right? So HD through to fail scale. So this is an example of taking an original rubric where the two elements of the task have been split in the rubric into Part A and Part B, and they've simply duplicated all of the criterion that were in the rubric into criterion 1 for Part 1, criterion 1 for Part 2. That allows the markers for each of those components to engage with those when they are ready to do so. So that's how they've approached the creation of the rubric for the mini Viva alongside the artifact submission of the presentation in this task. I'm going to stop there for a moment and check in with either Elise or anyone else that has put questions or wants to ask a question about what I've demonstrated so far before I show you through the actual building of this. And I am aware that we are approaching time as well. Does anyone want to ask any questions about what I've just shown there? Jacqueline.
Sorry, was trying to get off mute.
No worries.
Just a point of note there. The criteria says presentation and oral responses. Mm-hmm. And as you move across, it goes down to presentation or oral responses. But that's got to be hard to mark if you're only looking at the artifact. So it doesn't really work in this instance. So,
and I absolutely agree with you. And I guess I'm going to go back to the point that I made earlier is I'm not delving into the substance of the descriptors at this point. I completely concur with you that really thinking about when the marking is going to be happening, who's marking and what they're marking should then inform what goes into the actual descriptors. So if someone's marking the artifact, in my opinion, the substance of what goes into the scale descriptors should engage with that part of the marking process, what's going into the artifact. And similarly, the actual description that's going in for the supervised component should engage with that part of the marking process. I absolutely agree. But I think when this was put together initially, what they were wanting to get off the ground, timing was probably a feature as well, was that they needed to at least facilitate the marking of the first part versus the second, and maybe the next time round they will engage more with separating out those descriptors and values. It's a very good point though. All right, what I want to show you very quickly is that when we are using the Brightspace rubric tool to split these sections out, and if I go into my subject training site and open up the rubric tool, how easy it is to create those different areas of the rubric. So if we create a new rubric in here, you'll notice by default when we only have one section or one part, you don't have the opportunity to label that section. That feature only becomes available when you split it into multiple sections. So if I go down underneath our individual criterion areas, you'll see that we have the option to add a criteria group. So that's where now we have the opportunity to label them. So if we said that part 2, or part B, or whatever you want to call it, is the supervised component, we then get a chance to label those. And if we scroll back up to the first part, we can put that label in there as well. So that opportunity to label and distinguish between the two elements happens there once you start creating additional groups there. The rubric tool itself, we have workshops on, we've got PD on. Even in the Padlet board, I've actually linked to videos that go through this process, specifically around 3 different approaches. If I show you the board itself, moving down, there are 3 different approaches here for creating rubrics for supervised assessment. The first one is what we've just seen, where we've taken the original rubric and then split it in half, essentially showing a part A and a part B. So you're engaging with the marking within the same rubric. The second approach involves creating 2 rubrics because we want the students to submit first, have it marked, get feedback, and then engage with the evaluation of the supervised component. So 2 portals, 2 rubrics. And then the third approach is a slight variation on the 2. But there's a video or a clip that goes through that process for you within the board. And I do have a couple of don'ts for you to consider, which I'll talk about here. Don't try and have single criterion where you're engaging with both the supervised and the observed component of the task. It's simply going to be problematic for your markers and also for the students in understanding what's required and when. We've talked about that a number of times. If you do end up using multiple rubrics attached to a single assignment portal, you need to have a very, very clear reason for doing so, and understanding that the latest mark or marking of a rubric is going to feed through to the overall total inside Brightspace. And we've said, basically established that the golden rule with assignment portals and rubrics is if you have a single portal, you better have a single rubric attached to it. So I know that Elise and I probably can hang around here for a little bit to talk through any questions and comments that people might have, but I will point out that there's going to be subsequent sessions which delve more into the delivery of your supervised assessment, that notion of providing prompts and prompting students during the supervised assessment itself, and any kind of follow-up and conversation that you've had around today's process, looking at both designing a rubric and building the rubrics inside Brightspace. We're obviously happy to chat further around that process as well. So I'm going to stop the recording in a moment, but I will say thank you all for coming out for another PD session around supervised assessment. And this conversation will be continuing in the next series as well. And you'll see those sessions made available early next week. Thank you everyone for coming out, and I'll stop the recording there.